Hello, this is Module 4. Today we're going to be talking about study designs. So, essentially, what types of studies can be used to study different epidemiologic problems or questions. So, the 4 designs we're going to talk about are observational, or we're going to also call this cross-sectional, then case control, cohort, and randomized control trials. So just to review, remember we're talking about epidemiology. This is the study of both the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in specific populations. So risk factors or exposures and how those might affect different outcomes or diseases or health-related states. So there are 3 components. We can study who has the disease. We can describe the prevalence or the incidence of a disease. We can talk about what causes it and what we do about it. And usually the research progression happens in that order. First, we have to know where the disease occurs, who has it, then we can study what causes it, and then from there go on to how do we treat or prevent that condition. So probably you and I, we all know that physical activity and diet are related to health outcomes. We know that physical activity is good for us. We know that certain types of dietary decisions are good and some are bad. This week there was a big paper published that showed that, or suggested that some of the companies that produce foods high in sugar actually paid for research that would show that fat is linked to heart disease as opposed to sugar. So some types of controversy there, but by and large we know that what types of foods are good for us, what types are bad, we know what type of exercise is good, but how do we actually know that? We take that for granted typically, but that has to be shown in research. So there are 4 different ways, really, to study physical activity or diet and health outcomes. And these are the 4 types of study designs: cohort, case control, cross-sectional, and randomized control trials. And we're going to go through these 4 today. So the first is a cohort study. And we've actually already talked about cohort studies this semester. This is when you follow a group of individuals over time. So the Nurses' Health Study, for instance, they've followed nurses for many, many years and watched the progression or development of different diseases in these women. There are a number of cohort studies, and we'll talk about some more of those here. So, again, I know you've seen this before, but we're just going to talk about it in a little bit different context as a cohort study. The London Transport Authority study, remember that this was taken place, it was published in 1953. Individuals who worked for the London Transport Authority as either drivers, where they sat a lot, or conductors, where they did a lot of standing and walking, they were followed up over time to see, do they develop heart disease, do they have heart attacks, do they die of those cardiovascular problems. So that's a classic example of a cohort study. Measure some exposure, which in this case was their occupation, and then follow them to watch for different outcomes. So remember, we looked at this before when we were talking about how to calculate incidence and different rates, but now let's think about it in terms of a cohort study. So they looked at the rate of coronary thrombosis, is what they called it. This group, this column is those who had a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. Remember, the top half of the figure is the drivers, and then down here, this is the conductors. These are rates that you're looking at. So in the age group 35 to 44, the rate was 0.4. In the next age group, it was 1.5, and then 3.3. So the older you were, the older the drivers were, the more likely they were to have a heart attack. That's not surprising. We saw the same pattern in the conductors. But if you look at the standardized rate For drivers, 1.5, the standardized rate for conductors was 0.8. So what this means is that drivers overall were more likely to have a heart attack. Drivers sit more. So we don't know for sure that being a driver causes you to have a heart attack, but that could be, there's something going on here that needs further explanation. Immediate mortality, you see something very similar. So these are people who died of the heart attack that they had. You still see that the drivers had a rate of 0.9, whereas the conductors had less than half that rate at 0.4. That's the number of people who had immediate mortality per 1,000 man years observed. That's what you see here. If you don't understand the calculation, it's really not that critical. I want you to understand that comparing this number to this number shows drivers have higher incidence of bad outcomes than did the conductors. Then if you looked at the total incidence of heart-related disease, you see that the standardized rate for the drivers, 2.7. For the conductors, it was 1.9. So again, drivers were more likely to have bad things happen than were conductors. And so the author wondered, is this having to do with the physical activity component of their occupation? And this is really where the field of physical activity epidemiology starts. Another cohort study is the Harvard Alumni Health Study. You've heard about this one before. All subjects were males enrolled at Harvard somewhere between the years of 1916 to 1950. They actually began the study in 1962 so that they studied people who had gone to Harvard previously. They asked these individuals about their physical activity level, specifically participation in what they called light sports, strenuous sports, the number of flights of stairs climbed, and city blocks walked. Remember, most of these were businessmen living in large cities, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., on the East Coast, and so they were walking city blocks every day, climbing flights of stairs into skyscraper-type buildings. So those were appropriate questions at this time. Then they followed up all of the subjects in 1972, 88, and 93. If the subjects were alive, they asked them for information about have you developed certain diseases, do you have certain health problems. If they couldn't find the people, they looked for death certificates, and they recorded the cause of death for all of these individuals. And so there's a lot of research published from the Harvard Alumni Health Study, so I'm just going to show you what is related to physical activity and mortality. So here is just an example. Notice the sample size of the lowercase n that you see on the top of the screen. That is commonly used to indicate the number of participants in a study. So you can see that this study, a cohort study, typically is very large, 13,000 plus individuals in this study. And what they did is they grouped the participants into quartiles, groups of 4 quarters. So the bottom 25%, and then so on and so forth. So people who walked less than 5 kilometers per week. So remember, a 5K is approximately 3 miles. Between 5 and 10 kilometers per week, 10 to 20, and more than 20. And then what you see on this axis is the mortality rate. So a data point higher up on this graph means a higher mortality rate. So those who walked the least had the highest mortality rate. Those who walked the most had a lower mortality rate. So this is suggesting that distance walked affects your mortality. This is set up exactly the same way from the same data set, except instead of the distance walked, it's the number of stories or flights of stairs climbed per week. Less than 10, 10 to 20, 10 to, I think that's 35, it's hard to tell, and then 35 plus. And again, you see the same trend. more flights of stairs, lower mortality rate. And then this is incorporating intensity into that. So how much moderate activity do you get? And this is in kilojoules per week, so there's formulas to estimate that. And again, essentially doing more physical activity or more moderate activity was associated with a lower mortality rate. Then they also looked at vigorous activity, and you see very nicely this kind of stair-step trend. More vigorous activity per week was associated with a lower mortality rate. So this just further provided data to suggest that not only is physical activity associated with mortality rate, but there's what we call a dose response. The dosage, or the amount of physical activity, more is better. The dosage matters. It's not just some lowers your risk, more lowers your risk more. Okay, here's one more cohort study for you to think about. This one's called the Cooper Center Longitudinal Study, CCLS. Also, you sometimes see it called, they changed the name kind of in the middle, the Aerobics Center Longitudinal Study, so the ACLS. Either one, it's the same study. This is a clinic called the Cooper Clinic. It's based in Dallas, Texas. And what they do is they have individuals come to this clinic. They employ physicians, exercise physiologists, and so forth. And they do a full workup on these individuals. Blood pressure, cholesterol, they take blood, they do all kinds of testing. And they do what's called a graded exercise test. This is a test to where the person exercises to exhaustion, a fitness test. It's the very best way to measure fitness, and it's time consuming, it's expensive, but they do it because it provides a very, very rich data about the effects of physical fitness, not just physical activity, but physical fitness on health. There's over 100,000 individuals that are included in this database. So they have 3,000 different data points. So, systolic blood pressure might be one, diastolic blood pressure, total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and so on and so forth. They have 3,000 of those variables in their data set. The catch is that the participants in this study tend to be mostly white, male, and higher socioeconomic status because the testing is not free. It's pretty expensive. You get a lot of information, so a lot of people want to do this, but it's not free, and so certain people are more likely to do it. And that happens to be white males, higher socioeconomic status. I believe it costs around $3,000 to have the full workup. It takes about a day. And so, for obvious reasons, not everyone is going to be able to do that. Here's some data, though, from this study. There are hundreds of papers published with the ACLS data, but this is the data showing the relationship between physical fitness, not activity, but fitness, which is different. The relationship between fitness and all-cause mortality. Do they die for any reason? There's about 7,000 women and 25,000 men whose data they used. And so let's look at the women first. Here, the lightest gray bar, that's the low fitness group. They just grouped them into 3 groups: the lowest third fitness level, the middle third, and the upper third. So you can see that there isn't much difference in the death rate. So a higher bar means a higher risk of death. Not much difference between moderate and high, but those who are in the low fitness group are really about twice as likely to die as women who are either moderate or high fitness. With the men, there's more of this stair step. Being low fit is bad. It increases your risk considerably. And then you want to be in the high fitness group. This is the same exact setup again, except now instead of looking at all-cause mortality, we're looking at specifically mortality from cardiovascular disease. and you see the very same stair-step pattern. Low fitness is bad, high fitness is good. So being more fit seems to decrease risk of cardiovascular disease. Okay, so those are 3 cohort studies. Remember, this is when you take a group of people, follow them over time. You don't do anything to the people, you simply watch what happens to them over time. So the strengths of this type of study is that you can study many disease outcomes. Think about the Nurses' Health Study. You can study cancer and cardiovascular disease and multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease, and you name it, you can study it. Many, many, many disease outcomes. You can typically determine what we call time order. Did some exposure actually come before the outcome, the disease? We're going to talk more about this next week, but there are some types of study designs where you can't tell, did one thing really happen before the other? And if it didn't, if asbestos exposure didn't happen before cancer, then you can't say that asbestos exposure caused cancer. Cohort studies, you can typically tell which one came first. And then obviously the large number of subjects is very helpful. It's better to study 15,000 people than to study 15. You can be more confident in your findings if you study more people. It also allows us to study things that are exposures that are pretty rare. So maybe you had no way of knowing, but there was some chemical or some drug that people might have been exposed to or taken. Well, if you have 15,000 people in your cohort, very likely some of them were exposed to that. And so you can still study that. The weaknesses are that it's obviously, if you're going to watch people for 15 years, it takes 15 years to do that study. And so if there's an urgency to understanding a certain condition, that can be a problem. For instance, there is a drug in the 1950s it's a sedative, but it was found to counteract nausea, and so it was given to pregnant women who were very nauseous during their first trimester of pregnancy. Well, it turns out that this drug caused birth defects, but nobody knew it for many years. So that a cohort study wouldn't be a good way to study that, because you've got to stop those birth defects immediately. You need to figure out what's causing them instantly, as soon as possible. So waiting 10 or 15 years is not appropriate. They can be very expensive. There's a lot of, because it's so time consuming, it's very costly to pay researchers to do these studies. Another thing is a possible change in methods over time. I think the best example of this is how we measure body composition. Today, we can measure percent body fat using a lot of sophisticated techniques. DEXA is basically a fancy X-ray machine. But 30 years ago, that technology wasn't available. And so it's possible that changes that you see in some measurement, some outcome, might be because of the methods change. We might see changes in percent body fat, but is it because people are getting fatter, or is it because we change the way we measure percent body fat? It can be hard to tell, so that's a problem as well. Alright, so that was cohort studies. We follow a group of people over time. Next, we're going to talk about case control studies. This is when we compare what we call cases, which are a group that have the outcome that we're interested in. Usually it's a disease. We compare people who have disease A to controls who do not have that same disease. So this is typically looking backward. We have 50 people who have cancer and 50 people who don't have cancer, and then we say, okay, what's your physical activity like? What do you eat? Do you smoke? And ask about all these things that they have done in their life to see if we can figure out what causes that cancer. Okay, so here's a couple examples of case control studies. This is the Inner Heart Study. It was a pretty famous study. You can see their little logo describes it as a global study of risk factors in acute myocardial infarction, so heart attacks. So what they did was they wanted to study the causes of heart attacks, but from a global perspective. And so they did this worldwide because perhaps there's something in different parts of the world that contributes differently. So cases were people who had heart attacks. myocardial infarction. So they studied 15,000 plus individuals who had a heart attack, and they matched those to controls who did not have a heart attack. It's important that they matched to controls. You have to match on variables that you think are important for the disease that you're interested in. So for heart attacks, they said, well, males have more heart attacks, so sex is important, and for heart attacks, age is also important. So what they did is if you had a 60-year-old male who was your case, you would find a male who was as close to 60 as possible to be the control. It's very important that they matched on those characteristics. So all of the cases have had a heart attack, all the controls have not. And what they did is they said, okay, they asked about, you've had a heart attack or you haven't, do you smoke, do you have diabetes, do you have hypertension, do you have abdominal obesity, what's the psychosocial index, that's just a test for depression and those types of things. How many fruits and vegetables do you consume? Do you exercise? Do you consume alcohol? And they looked at this different genetic marker called ApoB, ApoA1 ratio that is thought to contribute to heart attacks. It's a genetic thing. For our purposes, we're going to focus on exercise. Okay, so what you see here on this axis is the odds ratio. You know what an odds ratio is now. So any box to the right of this line at 1, remember an odds ratio greater than 1 means an increased risk. So anything to the right of that line would be an increased risk of heart attack. Anything to the left would be a decreased risk of heart attack. So for exercise, this means that exercise, this is the males, there's a lower risk of myocardial infarction in males who exercise. That odds ratio looks to me to be about 0.8. So a 20% reduction in risk of heart attack in males who exercise. Here's the actual odds ratio, 0.77. So it was a 23% reduction. And then the odds ratio here for females was 0.48. So a 52% reduced risk of heart attack in females who exercised. And you interpret all of these the same way. If we look at fruits and vegetables, you see numbers that are similar. So again, this is a case control study. They didn't have to follow people up over time. You could do this study, really, if you had all your cases, you could do it in one day. You ask the cases and the controls all these questions, and then you calculate the odds ratio. So here's another example. There's a condition called persistent pulmonary hypertension. It's abbreviated PPHN, that develops in babies after they're born. It is very dangerous. It causes great respiratory distress. It can cause a lot of problems. So physicians began to think maybe there's a relationship between drugs that a mom is taking during pregnancy. And eventually they became curious about the effect of different antidepressants. There's a type of antidepressant called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI. These are very common antidepressants that are taken by a wide variety of people, including sometimes pregnant women. So they wanted to study if these SSRIs during pregnancy are related to babies developing this condition called persistent pulmonary hypertension. So what they did was they selected some hospitals. They called all the moms of babies born with this condition, PPHN, and then they matched to some controls who did not have the condition. The babies did not have the condition. They called those mothers as well. 69% of the moms that were called whose babies had PPHN participated, 68% of the controls did. So that it's good that those numbers are similar. And they matched the controls by the hospital that they were born at and by the date of birth of the baby. So you've got babies who have this condition, babies who don't, and they ask the moms, did you take these drugs at any point in your pregnancy, and if so, at what point in your pregnancy? Okay, so let's start here. Here we're just talking about, did you use the drug or not? So there were 377 mothers whose babies had PPHN, and 836 matched controls whose babies did not. And 94.7% of the PPHN moms never took depressants. 95.6% of the control moms never took antidepressants. So it's fairly uncommon to take these drugs. Here's your odds ratios. They call them crude odds ratios. That's just a normal calculation like we learned about last week. You can also adjust your odds ratios for different variables that you think might be important. Don't worry about the math, but just know that they try to account for some other variables. I think like the mother's age or something like that. I can't remember. But that it would be, if you thought mom's age might be important here, you could statistically adjust for that. So, your reference group is those who never took the drugs. So let's just look at the crude ratios for now. Women who took the antidepressants at any time during pregnancy, the odds ratio was 1.3. So they were 30% more likely to have a baby with PPHN. Except, let's look at the confidence interval. Here's your confidence interval. 0.7 to 2.2. That includes 1. So what that means is that 1.3 is actually not different than 1.0 statistically. So there's really not an increased risk according to this data. Now if you looked at those who took an SSRI specifically, there's other types of depressants that's included here. If they took an SSRI, the odds ratio is a little higher, but the confidence interval still includes 1. If they took a different antidepressant, the odds ratio is actually a little lower than 1, but again, the confidence interval includes 1. So this first data is just, there's no effect of any of these things. What if they looked, though, at the timing of the antidepressants? So if you don't incorporate the timing, what we saw previously, it doesn't matter. But what if we look at the timing? So what they did, again, women who never took the antidepressants, they're the reference category. Women who took antidepressants before 20 weeks, this is any antidepressant, not just SSRIs, their odds ratio was 0.5. But again, this confidence interval is pretty wide. Okay, it includes 1. Women who took antidepressants after 20 weeks of pregnancy, so the second half of pregnancy, the odds ratio is 2.9. So they were 290% more likely to have a baby with PPHN. This confidence interval does not include 1. So we're sure that there's actually an increased risk. Then, if we look at just SSRIs, this is really the research question that they wondered about. Is it these specific type of drugs? So if we look again, women before 20 weeks, there was a lower odds ratio, but it's not significant. The confidence interval includes 1. But this is really the hallmark of the paper right here. After 20 weeks, taking an SSRI increased the baby's odds of developing persistent pulmonary hypertension by 500%, 510% really. Very, very critical finding. And this was related to a recommendation that women who are taking antidepressants, that if at all possible, they be weaned from those by 20 weeks of pregnancy. So very important data that went into making recommendations for antidepressant use for women during pregnancy. Okay, so those are 2 examples of case control studies. We saw cases who had heart attacks. We saw cases where the baby had persistent pulmonary hypertension compared to controls where those outcomes were not present. The strengths of these types of studies, again, I said basically you could do this in one day if you had all your cases, quick, and because it's quick, it tends to be inexpensive. You need fewer subjects. You very rarely see thousands of subjects. It's usually hundreds or sometimes even under 100 subjects. And because you're using these cases, you can study very rare diseases, rare types of cancer, rare genetic diseases, things that if you did a cohort study and you picked some really rare disease, you might have 3 people in your cohort with the disease. Well, you can't study it that way. 3 people in a sample is not enough. But if you can find all the cases, compare them to controls, it's a way to study rare diseases. Some weaknesses, though, are that there's problem with time order, so it can be hard to show that the exposure came before the outcome. Maybe somebody with a heart attack example, that inner heart study, we don't really know for sure, based on the study design, that the exercise came before the heart attack. Maybe they had a heart attack and therefore they don't exercise because they're afraid to. We don't really know that for sure. There's also issues with recall bias. Recall bias is a situation where people remember things differently because of something that happened to them, usually something bad. So an example in my field of expertise, which is exercise during pregnancy, is miscarriage. So women who have a miscarriage, if you ask them about things that happened before the miscarriage, they may remember it differently because they had something bad happen. So women who had a miscarriage might be more likely to say, oh my goodness, I took Tylenol one time, and really freak out about that, than somebody who didn't have something bad happen. If you ask them what drugs you took, they might have said, no. They may not remember, they may remember it differently. So recall bias can be a really big problem. Any bad thing that happens can really impact the way people remember what happened in the past. And it's not useful for rare exposures. So, if you were exposed to a rare, unusual chemical, the way to study that would be with a cohort to follow up over time, not a case study. So we've talked about cohort studies, follow a group of people over time. We've talked about case control studies, where you identify cases, compare them to controls who don't have that disease, and look for similarities or differences. The next type of study is a cross-sectional study. This is when you study the relationship between some exposure and some outcome at only one point in time. This is the most simple study design. So here's an example from this is kind of my area of research. Physical activity during pregnancy. So this study looked at physical activity during pregnancy, and they were interested in fetal growth. So how big the baby gets. So what they did is they looked at the relationship between a mom's physical activity during pregnancy and what they called the fetal growth ratio. So fetal growth ratio is just the baby's weight at birth divided by what's the predicted birth weight for that gestational age. So gestational age is how many weeks pregnant the baby was born. So a normal gestational age is 40 weeks. Most babies are born at 40 weeks gestation. So if a baby's born at 30 weeks, they're premature, you would expect the baby to be smaller. So the fetal growth ratio just takes that into account. It would take the baby's birth weight, whatever it is, at 30 weeks and divide it by what would be predicted for a 30-week gestation baby to weigh. They also used accelerometry to measure physical activity. This is a very sophisticated way to measure physical activity. So they didn't just ask women, hey, how active are you? But they took a pretty good measure of it. And then they divided into quartiles. So the lowest 25%, the next lowest, the next highest, and the highest 25% in terms of physical activity. So notice the sample size here, there's only 51 participants, and that's not uncommon in a cross-sectional study. So what they did is they have quartiles here. So this is the lowest active group, and the next lowest active, so forth. Group 4 is the most active. And so these are the birth weights. So the low active group, the mean birth weight is 4,000 grams, And if you look down at the most active group, the mean birth weight is about 3,400 grams. So there's a pretty big difference there. Active moms have smaller babies, but 3,400 grams is not like scary small, problematic small. It's small, but probably in a good way. Here, just because physical activity is related to fetal growth does not mean that one causes the other. In this case, this is very interesting, and it's still important research, but we would need to do a different type of study to see if we can further nail down that is maternal physical activity really causing fetal growth, or is there something else happening here? Okay, the last of the 4 types of studies that I want to talk about are randomized control trials. These are going to be abbreviated RCT a lot. These are true experiments. None of the studies that we've seen so far are true experiments because they don't actually manipulate anything. When you manipulate the exposure, that's when you have a true experiment. So you have to do something to people. Give them a drug, tell them to be physically active, tell them to not eat bacon, whatever. You have to change something about what they're exposed to. In order to have an RCT, you have to have these 3 criteria that you see on the slide. Manipulate the exposure, randomization, and a control group or a placebo group. You have to have some group that's of comparison. Okay, so you take study participants and you randomly assign them to either an intervention group or a control or a placebo. A control group is a group that gets no treatment. A placebo group is a group that gets a fake treatment. So in a drug trial, for instance, if your intervention is Prozac, some drug, the intervention is the drug, the placebo group would get a drug, a pill that looks like the real thing and tastes like the real thing, but it's not the real thing. So they would be randomly assigned to either the intervention or the control or placebo group, and then you measure whatever it is that you're interested in. Okay, so in order to be an RCT, you have to have those 3 things. Manipulate the exposure, randomly assign to which group, and have either a control group or placebo group. You can't have a placebo group for safe physical activity. There's no fake treatment for physical activity. So if you had a group exercise 3 times a week, you would have a control group that didn't exercise 3 times a week. So the RCTs are the preferred study design whenever possible because they minimize what's called bias. Randomization, when you randomly decide who's in which group, this is done to increase the chances that unmeasured variables are equally distributed. So if you randomly assigned people into 2 groups, say I have 100 college students and I'm going to have them do physical activity intervention. So some of them are going to exercise 3 times a week and some won't. If I randomly assign them, then the percentage of males and females in the 2 groups should be similar. The percentage of kinesiology majors in the 2 groups should be similar, and so on and so forth. If I don't randomly assign them and I have 80% females in one of the group and only 20% females in the other group, if I find differences between my 2 groups, it might be because there's different numbers of males and females, not because of the physical activity. So randomization is absolutely critical. I also do what's called blinding. There's 2 types of blinding, single and double blind. Single blind is when the participants don't know which group they're in. It's really hard to do for physical activity studies because people know if they're exercising or not. But whenever possible, for sure with like a drug trial, you would want to blind the participants. Double blind is even better. The participants don't know which group they're in, and the researcher doesn't know which group they're in. Participants can, usually they won't do it on purpose, but they may, if they know which group they're in, they may act differently. If the researcher knows, say it's a study where you're giving let's say you're studying the effects of caffeine on exercise performance. If you're the researcher and you know that the person got caffeine and you think caffeine works, then you may cheer harder for that person, even not purposefully often, but you may actually do a better job of encouraging the person during an exercise test than if you know that they got the placebo and you think, well, it's a placebo, it's not going to work. So you just say, yay, go faster, and you don't really encourage them. One other thing to mention with randomized control trials is intent to treat. You have to use this approach to do a clinical trial or a randomized control trial. And this says that everyone who is randomized is included in the analysis. So if you start the study, you're in the analysis. Even if you drop out, even if you are in, say it's a physical activity study and you're assigned to the control group and you start doing CrossFit, well, you're still in the control group. Okay, so because of this, you want to minimize dropout. Dropout, if people quit the study, that's a big problem. So if a treatment is really time-consuming or it's a drug and it makes you really, really sick, people might drop out of the intervention group at a faster rate than they might drop out of the control group. And this is a big problem because of intent to treat. You still have to compare people even if they quit. So you've got to try to minimize dropout. And then crossover. This is when somehow the control or the placebo group gets some of the treatment. So this might be if, say you're testing out a new teaching strategy. I teach 2 sections of anatomy and I want to try this new technique. So I teach the technique to one of my sections of anatomy and not the other one. And the one section thinks it's awesome and they start teaching their friends in the other section. Well, the section that's supposed to be the control is getting some of the treatment, the technique. That's called crossover, and it's going to make it hard to tell whether the technique really works because your control group actually got some of the technique. So you want to minimize crossover to the extent possible. So the silly little study that I had you read, the Kissing Boo Boos study, was obviously not real, but it was published in a real journal because the point was to demonstrate what a strong study design for a randomized control trial. So obviously they said in the study that it was a randomized trial, but go back and look. Did they intervene in some way? Did they have randomization? Did they have blinding? How did they minimize bias? Look for all of those steps. So what was the intervention? It was the kissing of the boo-boos. The control was, the intervention was by the mother. The control was really more of a placebo. It was by someone else. But remember, they blinded so that the child didn't know who was doing the kissing of the boo-boo. And then look back for techniques to minimize bias. Did they blind? Did they randomize? How are they trying to minimize bias in this study? It's actually a really good example of ways to have a proper study design in terms of randomized control trial. Here's another example of a more serious nature. This is one of my favorite exercise studies. I just think it's really cool. The question they wanted to know is, does the timing of taking ibuprofen affect response to resistance exercise training? So this is a bone mineral density study. So you're probably aware that if you exercise, do weight-bearing exercise, of which resistance exercise, weightlifting is very much a weight-bearing exercise, then it can increase your bone mineral density. Right? So women who are at risk of osteoporosis say it's highly encouraged that they do resistance training. So I'm honestly not sure how this started, but there started to be curiosity about the role of ibuprofen. So what this study did is they looked at ibuprofen, but they wondered, when should we take it, before or after? So these white bars are women who took an ibuprofen before their workout and a placebo after. Everyone took 2 pills. The gray bars, they took a placebo before and an ibuprofen. Oh yeah, this is mislabeled. Sorry. I forgot about that. It should be placebo before, placebo after. So the gray bar, they didn't actually take any ibuprofen at all. And then the black bar is placebo before and ibuprofen after. Okay. And you're looking at change in bone mineral density. That's what's on this axis. So any bars above are an increase in bone mineral density, which is good. That's what you want. You want to see more density, thicker bones with resistance training. Any bars below are decrease in bone mineral density. And then you see these different locations in the body. So lumbar spine, hip, femoral neck is the part of the hip. Trochanter is a different part of the hip. Femoral shaft is the thickness of the thigh bone, the femur. And so what you see here basically is that the biggest increases by far in bone mineral density were in those who took ibuprofen after their workouts. If you just do resistance training, which is supposed to increase bone mineral density, look at this. There's a tiny, tiny increase here, here. There's actually a decrease at the femoral neck, here and here. But if you take ibuprofen after you do your resistance training, there's an increase of up to 2% bone mineral density in some of these sites. This is really important. So it appears, at least from this data, that doing resistance training to improve bone mineral density really isn't effective unless you take an ibuprofen after. It's a very simple thing, and yet it can make a huge, huge difference. Well, this is an example of a randomized control trial. I'll tell you the answer. Yes. Why? They were random. The participants were randomized to which group they were in. Did they take the ibuprofen before, after, or not at all? There was a placebo group. Actually, there were 3 different groups. It was kind of unusual because there was not exactly a placebo group and an intervention group. There were variations. But there was randomization, and then there was blinding. The participants didn't know what they were taking. So what was the treatment? It was the ibuprofen timing. The non-treatment was obviously the placebo. But here's a question I want you to think about. What made this study different from a more traditional randomized control trial? And I just want to point out in this study that it really, yes, the treatment was the ibuprofen or not, but this was a little unique because they had to do the exercise also. Everyone did resistance training. And so that wasn't part of the treatment per se, but it was absolutely necessary to see the effects of the treatment. So everyone did the resistance training, and then some took the ibuprofen and some did not. So that makes it a little bit unique. So randomized control trials, their main pro is that they minimize bias, and they are the best designed to show a causation. X does cause Y. Again, we're going to talk more about causation next week, but for now, randomized control trials by far are the best designed to show, does a variable really cause some outcome. The cons are related to ethical concerns typically. For instance, this is most common in drug trials, or you may hear of people in the late stages of a terminal illness, maybe a cancer, who are trying a clinical trial. Well, if someone is going to enter a clinical trial, especially for a disease that's terminal in nature, remember, randomization is necessary. It's not a randomized control trial if there's no randomization. But there's no guarantee that they get a drug. They may get a placebo. Well, somebody who's terminally ill wants the real drug. They want to try everything. But if there's nobody that's the control group, we have no idea to know if the drug really worked. If everybody's in the drug, if everyone is in the intervention group and it works, we don't know if it's really the drug or if it's the act of swallowing a pill. We don't know if it works or how well it works. So there has to be a control group. But obviously that can be ethically challenging to understand and to deal with. There's also problems, like I mentioned, a lot of times there's dropout that's different in the treatment versus control group, and that can make it really hard to tell if the treatment is working or not. I also just want to mention community trials. They're very, very much like randomized control trials, except sometimes you can't randomize individuals. For instance, say we want to know about physical education in schools. Well, it's really hard to give PE to one kid and not to another. So what they do is they typically do it by classes. This class is going to get PE and this class isn't. Or this school is going to get PE and this school isn't. So you don't randomize the individuals, you randomize a larger aggregate group. Or fluoride in water. They wanted to fluoridate water to see if it helps reduce dental problems. Well, you can't provide fluoride to one child and not to his sibling. So they would provide fluoride in some communities and not others. Well, that's still sort of a randomized control trial. It's just a variation of it, and we typically call these community trials. Again, very similar to the randomized control trial, except that the intervention is at a community level, not an individual level. So some examples, if we add sidewalks to some communities and leave others as is there a change in the physical activity levels in that community? Or if we increase advertisement for parks and rec in some communities, does park usage increase? Those are some examples. There are some problems with this. One issue can be migration between communities. So if somebody moves from one community where there's no intervention to where there is, or vice versa, that can be problematic. People who are lost to follow up, so maybe we don't measure the outcome for some reason. In some people, that's a problem. And then it can be really difficult to measure some of these dependent variables. Physical activity in a whole community, for instance, is really hard to assess. And so that can just be something to keep in mind. Okay, so I want to give you a few review questions here just to make sure that you're understanding. So here's just an example. You want to know if orange juice consumption is related to the number of colds that people get. What type of study design would be the best? So you can stop the recording, think that through before I give you the answer. There's a lot of different ways you could do this. You could do a cross-sectional study where you simply ask people, how much orange juice do you drink, maybe per week? How many glasses of orange juice per week do you drink? And how many colds a year do you get? And then you could see if there's a relationship there. You could do a cohort. You could say nurses' health, for instance. Add a question about how much orange juice do you drink? And then over the years, see how many colds they get. The best way to do this is to give some people orange juice and some people some kind of control placebo substance and watch over time to see if they get colds. That's the best because it eliminates the most error and or bias. Here's another one. In this figure on the right, it is shown that the number of Nobel Prize winners per country is associated with chocolate consumption. What type of study design is this? it gives it away a couple of ways. First is the type of graph. There's two axes, and you're simply looking at a correlation. Also, in the caption under figure 1, it says correlation. If you see correlation, that means cross-sectional, almost always. This is actually real data, which is kind of interesting. But this is just kind of another fun example of correlation doesn't mean causation. People don't win Nobel Prizes because they consume a lot of chocolate. I don't know why these two things are related, but they are. So this is definitely a cross-sectional study. And here's one more. You do a study where you provide either Skittles or M&Ms to participants before they do a standing long jump. After analyzing the data, you find that consuming Skittles prior to long jumping results in an increased jump of 2 plus or minus 0.2 inches. What type of design is this? Probably this is a randomized control trial. Because you're intervening, you're giving the participants something, Skittles or M&Ms. It doesn't say that they were randomized, but if they were, that would definitely be an RCT. Okay, this week you have 2 assignments, as usual. You have Epi in the News and your Module 4 quiz due by Friday at 11:59 p.m. Let us know if you have any questions.